and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit us online at projectionsinc.com and iriconsultants.com. I am Jennifer Oraquad, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. In recent years, the visibility of trans men and women has soared in America, thanks to the internet, to mass media, and the advancement of LGBTQ plus rights, and of course to all of those who have come forward to speak their truth. And while awareness and acceptance are certainly on the rise, it's still a tremendous challenge to be trans today. And those challenges extend to the workplace. My guest today is David Baboolall. David is an associate partner with McKinsey Company and recently wrote a feature for McKinsey titled Being Transgender at Work, which explored those challenges by conducting research that provides new insights into the participation, plight, and precarity of transgender people at work. David, thanks so much for joining me here today on Project HR.
And thanks so much for having me, Jennifer. Super excited to chat with you today.
So, David, your article mentions that one of the major issues in fostering inclusion and acceptance of trans people in the workplace is developing an agreed-upon vocabulary to accurately understand and discuss the state of being transgender. So, with that in mind, let's address vocabulary here. When we talk about gender and sex, what are we talking about?
It's a great question, Jennifer, and thank you for starting off with this, because vocabulary tends to be the reason why people don't engage with this topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we think about it, according to the Human Rights Campaign, transgender is an umbrella term. And it's an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. And it can, but doesn't always, include people who identify as non-binary or genderqueer. Even in the trans community, it does not have, there isn't total agreement on terminology. As one of our survey respondents actually told us, they said, I don't know that I'm ready to be anything besides just a little queer. I feel even in the LGBTQ plus community, if you're not fully transitioning, you're not always viewed as really quote unquote trans. And in our research, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we refer to trans people as those who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, including those with binary trans identities, transgender male or transgender female, and non-binary trans identities. Cisgender people are neither transgender nor non-binary.
So, in light of all that, I would love to hear a little bit about your personal experience of being a trans person in corporate America. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Definitely. And I will say this is a slightly complicated question, as I'm biracial, queer, transgender, all in corporate America. But let me focus on when I became more open about my gender identity in the workplace. The findings that resonate the most with my personal experience in the workplace relate to deciding whether or not coming out in terms of my gender identity and sexual orientation was truly the safest option. If the cities and specific towns where potential projects and clients were located would welcome unsafe experiences, and if being my true, authentic self would bring, candidly, more harm than happiness. I will say I'm grateful that I'm able to work with a set of colleagues and clients that have used, for one example, my shift in pronouns from he, him to they, them as an opportunity for awareness, as an opportunity for education, understanding. They've been able to bring in their teams and communities in which they're visible leaders and voice their influence. And even so, I've been able to leverage the occasional scoff, which candidly, it's not occasional, as an opportunity to invite ignorance to turn into wisdom. So it's been a journey, and it will continue to be a journey. And I'm grateful for the community that I've been able to share this with.
So I think a lot of people and a lot of companies may think of trans or non-binary people as statistically insignificant portion of the population, but that's not really true, is it?
Absolutely not. Given the more than 2 million transgender people in the US and the more than 1.2 million that identify as non-binary, employers cannot and should not continue to ignore a significant population that experiences systemic barriers to employment, systemic barriers to work performance, systemic barriers to career progression. So the answer is no.
So with those numbers in mind, making efforts to be inclusive towards transgender people in the workplace begins to make more business sense, right?
Absolutely. And maybe it makes sense at this time to talk a little bit about the motivation behind the study, if that works, Jen.
Sure.
There has been progress in DEI more broadly, and you all know
Hmm.
this, over the last
Hmm.
several decades, which has impacted so many marginalized communities and many of my identities personally.
Hmm.
That has not translated into actual improvements for the trans experience in the US, despite the longstanding struggle for comprehensive LGBTQ plus rights. Being transgender today often means facing not only stigma, but increasing threats to safety, existence, whether it's record high levels of deadly violence, a record number of restrictive legislative proposals, or a higher than typical likelihood of encountering employment or housing discriminations. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a few spotlights, right? The executive order from President Biden, landmark 2020 Supreme Court ruling that protected LGBTQ plus people from workplace discrimination. But those efforts can, have, and will face roadblocks. And
Hmm.
some employers focus more on supporting sexual orientation diversity in the workplace than on gender identity or expression. And all too frequently, the trans experience may not even register on the radars of employers when they work on corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
So, David, let's talk a little bit about your findings. This is such a huge topic to take on. Can you tell us what all was involved in conducting the research and compiling all of this information?
Yeah, so the short answer is it was a lot.
Yeah, I'll bet.
um, so our research builds on some prior McKinsey research about how the LGBTQ plus community fares in the workplace. And we do that by examining data on multifaceted transgender representation in the workforce, the trans experience at work, and stories from the lived experience of trans identifying employees. We also include things like recommendations for businesses to better support the trans community at work by providing a safe and inclusive environment. But the crux of it is our analysis draws on primary and secondary sources. First, we mined our 2019 survey of roughly 2,000 employees. We then also leveraged our extensive Women in the Workplace 2021 research, which was conducted in partnership with Lenient.org, which reflects contributions from more than 60,000 people, of which we had a group of over 150 trans employees who told us about the trans experience at the work. We also ran our bespoke 2021 workplace inclusion across the gender spectrum survey, which spoke to 250 trans folks and 250 cisgender folks in the United States about their experiences throughout the work life cycle, from education to application and recruiting to the end of employment. Finally, we analyzed 2020 BRFSS, so the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data from the CDC. And this source included responses from about 1,000 adults identifying as trans across the US population.
And so, what do you consider to be the headlines here from your research?
This is always a tough question because I want to talk about so much, but
Sure.
the most defining statistic finding from the study were those anchored in safety, where other populations strive to feel included in the workplace. Transgender workers strive to feel safe. And when I say safe, I mean from physical, from mental, or emotional violence. It's
Hmm.
not one of the three. Safety at 59% was by far the most cited concern for transgender people in their decisions not to pursue certain industries. Not seeing others like them in these industries, not being able to bring their full selves to work, and not feeling support for trans or gender nonconforming people were also high on the list.
Mm.
And of the folks surveyed, 50% noted that they didn't feel they could bring their full selves to work in those industries. So to me, the big takeaway from our research was around safety and how can we ensure that our trans colleagues, friends, peers, bosses, direct reports feel safe at work.
For sure. So, were you surprised by any of the findings?
Surprised? No. I think being able to articulate this story in a cohesive manner was eye-opening, right?
Mm.
If I can talk a little bit about things outside of the safety element, what we found was trans individuals are underemployed, they're
Hmm.
underpaid,
Hmm.
and they're both of those things even when equally educated, right? And if I can start with employment, only 73% of trans adults are in the workforce, compared to 82% of cisgender folks.
Hmm.
And the trans respondents to our survey were 2 times more likely to be unemployed than cisgender folks. And then when we look at wages, it's equally as stark. Trans people also make less money than cisgender people do.
Hmm.
The average annual household income of a trans adult is about $17,000 less than of a cisgender one. And our survey showed that they are 2.4 times more likely to work in the food or retail industry, in which the large population are entry-level jobs paying the minimum
Mm-hmm.
wage.
Mm-hmm.
And the one final thing that I'll say about this is education is not an equalizer. The trans respondents to our survey were 1.7 times less likely to have a college degree than cisgender people. They also earn less. 19% of cisgender college graduates make $50,000 or less, compared to 26% of transgender graduates.
Hmm. It's interesting because you might not have been surprised by those findings, but I'll bet some of our listeners are surprised to hear those statistics. And understanding begins with understanding the data. So, David, I'm going to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, I want to discuss the challenges of being transgender at work and how workplaces can begin to craft a more inclusive policy for transgender employees. Stay with us.
Your frontline leaders need skills and knowledge to support your organization's growth. They've got to motivate their team, support employees when they struggle, and connect with their people, all while continually improving their own skills. To help make your organization more successful, the A Better Leader team has created a free guide to selecting and educating your leaders. Before you hire another supervisor, before you give another merit-based promotion, read this practical guide. The 4 Qualities That Make Great Leaders provides practical tips on creating better leaders for your organization. The free guide also includes actionable steps on testing potential hires for these qualities during the hiring process, so your supervisors have what they need from day one. Download this guide now at projectionsinc.com/abetterleader. You'll be glad you did.
I'm back with David Baboolall, Associate Partner at McKinsey Company and co-writer for the article Being Transgender at Work. Now, David, in your article, you address the challenges that transgender people face throughout every step of the employment life cycle. Can you briefly outline some of those issues?
Definitely. I started to talk about safety, started talking about fear. Trans fear is evident in the numbers that we've articulated in our research. Less than half of trans adults are comfortable being fully open about their gender identity at work, with 2/3 not fully open to share their gender identity at all with customers or clients. And in our survey, 60% cited that safety was their biggest concern choosing industries for them to actually work in. And so if we take a huge step back based on these numbers, transgender workers are migrating to jobs where they feel safe,
Hmm.
which means that they can feel excluded from lucrative professions and fully participating in the economy. We found that during the application process, trans people are 1.5 times less likely to be their full selves. And during the interview process, they're 1.3 times less likely to be their full selves. So even before we're talking about entering the door to your corporation, sitting at your desk, logging into your computer, there is a massive disparity when it comes to being your true, authentic self at work
Mm-hmm.
and bringing your whole self to work each and every day.
And all of these challenges can make it very difficult for employees to talk about their gender identity at work. And as a result, many choose not to. So, how does that impact them as people? And how does it impact their contributions on the job?
And so we've already talked about the fact that trans employees are less likely to feel that they can bring their whole self to work compared to cisgender employees. And this has massive impact on their day-to-day contributions, how they interact with their peers, how they interact with their bosses. Trans employees are more than 3 times more likely than cisgender employees to delay or skip meetings. So presence is a clear issue. 55% do not talk in meetings. 41% actually avoid colleagues. And close to 2 times of trans employees are saying that they don't have feedback or resources to be promoted. And so this disconnect of identity, of inclusion, of equity in the workplace severely impacts the ability for trans individuals to contribute to their day-to-day job, to interact with their teammates, and to truly progress across the corporate ladder.
But employees who are open about their gender identity also face challenges. Let's talk about what they may be dealing with.
For folks that are open about their gender identity, it really comes down to, now that they're open about their gender identity, what do the resources, what do the communities, what do the networks truly look like on a day-to-day basis? And what we're seeing is that trans employees are 2 times more likely to not see leaders above them who look and seem like them compared to cisgender respondents. So you're sitting in this massive auditorium of your peers and not being able to see a future you at your organization.
Mm-hmm.
This significantly prohibits trans employees to say, yes, I do want to be there 5 to 10 years in the future. Yes, I can see myself as a leader. Yes, I want to be a leader in the organization, because they don't see those inspirational, motivational role models that they identify with at the top of the ladder.
Mm-hmm. All right, David, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Project HR Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and my guest today is David Baboolall, Associate Partner at McKinsey Company and co-writer for the article Being Transgender at Work. We are back. So, David, if we want to improve transgender inclusion in our workplaces, where do we begin?
Overall, it starts with education and awareness.
Okay.
Going back to some of the things that we started to talk about at the top of the conversation, the trans experience often gets erased or ignored because people simply don't have the vocabulary to talk about it, or are afraid they'll actually cause offense by getting words they do know wrong. To craft more inclusive policies for transgender employees, it's important to understand the barriers that trans people contend with, not only in the workplace, but outside of it as well. CEOs, business unit leaders, management team members need to be clear that their focus on DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is truly inclusive of the transgender experience.
So what are some of the ways our companies can promote ourselves as a trans-inclusive workplace?
Yeah, there are so many ways companies can be advocates for their transgender employees, and I'll list a couple of them. The first is to be intentional in recruiting. Companies should connect with potential new hires, participate in recruitment events and career fairs that are tailored to the trans communities. And yes, there are recruitment events, career fairs that are truly tailored to the trans community. The second is offer trans affirming benefits. Whether it be your HR team, your DEI team, those teams can be prepared to show up as allies by making sure that company benefits for employees are both trans friendly and trans specific. Things like mental health care support, gender affirmative surgery, hormone therapy. Third is crafting trans inclusive policies and programs. And a lot of these may not come naturally to those that sit in your human resources department or your DEI group, but things like reviewing company dress codes, eliminating gender specific language, ensuring that your diversity trainings include anti-bias, anti-harassment, anti-discrimination. All of those are nuanced to that of the transgender experience. And the last one I'll mention is signaling an inclusive culture, ensuring that pronouns are used and updated across all forms and documents. Preferred names are the same. And we start instituting things like gender neutral bathrooms in the offices that we may or may not require individuals to come into.
So you mentioned normalizing the use of pronouns, which completely makes sense, but does requiring pronoun usage at work put those who aren't open about their gender identity in a difficult spot?
I love this point because as we know, right, there are so many of our trans colleagues are not open about their gender identity at work today. And this term required, right, ensuring that every single employee introduces themselves with their pronouns at the beginning of the meeting may not necessarily be the best thing for your closeted trans employees. The way that I like to think about it, and in my own teams, I introduce myself each and every time, regardless of the group. So I may know them, I may not know them. I always start off with David Baboolall, they, them pronouns. And I do that because using those pronouns are important to me, right? And if a colleague does not introduce themselves with their pronouns, I tend to ask, what pronouns do you go by? And I use those pronouns. But if we start requiring every single person to start with their pronouns, we put our closeted trans colleagues, those that may not necessarily be ready to be open about their gender identity with their colleagues, in an uncomfortable position that actually might have more negative mental strain, emotional strain on them than we want.
For sure. So, gender identity, even just the concept of it, can be a heated subject. So, how can a company that wants to become more inclusive deal with those who might be resistant to change?
This question's an interesting one, and I think about it all the time. And I was recently reading something, and I came across this phrase, right? Compassion does not require comprehension. And the crux of it is, you need not fully understand my personal experience as a trans person in the workplace to want things to go well for me, or for me to be treated like a human being, or for me to be treated with inclusion and equity in the workplace. And so for folks that are resistant to quote unquote change, resistant to learn, resistant to engage in conversations about the trans experience, I tend to ask them why, right?
Mm.
And
hmm
starting with what is prohibiting you from engaging with trans colleagues, having these conversations, sitting down and learning,
hmm
um, and and then we go from there. The reality is, not everyone wakes up every day and says, I want everyone to be equal and to be
Right.
included and for equity to exist. But we have to start somewhere. And
hmm
sometimes those conversations will take much longer, will require more effort, will not see progress as quickly. But what I like to tell everyone is, you don't need to understand every single part of being a trans person at work to want them to exist in a place and in a way that makes them feel safe and makes them feel heard and allows them to exist without thinking about harm.
So, David, I'm fascinated by your work and your research. If I want to learn more about you, about McKinsey & Company, where can I go?
Luckily, we are quite easy to find online. And so I would highly recommend folks check out our website. So um, going to the McKinsey.com website and checking out our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Our
hmm
trans piece was published at the end of last year. We've also recorded a couple of sessions with different individuals that talk about this topic, and we're continuing to push on this topic. Later on this year, we're going to publish our second foray into this topic and really dive into intersectionality. And I welcome individuals to continue to have conversations with us about this topic.
For sure. And for our audience, those links will all be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, David, it is time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I am not ready, but we should march on.
All right, ready as you'll ever be, right? All right,
Yes.
so our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about transgender inclusion in the workplace. So in your opinion, David, which of these quotes about inclusion speaks the loudest? Openness may not completely disarm prejudice, but it's a good place to start. Or we should indeed keep calm in the face of difference and live our lives in a state of inclusion and wonder at the diversity of humanity.
Both of them are fantastic, but I will go with the first one. Openness may not completely disarm prejudice, but it's a good place to start.
I like that one as well. All right, next question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
The best book I've read recently, I don't read very often, but have been fascinated with sleep. And so the most recent book that I've read, which has actually helped me quite a bit, is Why We Sleep, which actually helped me better understand sleep, dreams, and candidly how to get more hours on my pillow.
Interesting. All right, what is your favorite thing about the work that you do?
There are so many things that make me excited to be at work, but my personal passion is to make the world a better place for Black and brown people and queer people, and I get to do that literally each and every day of my work, which has been fantastic.
And next question, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Don't take life too seriously.
I think the rest of that quote is you'll never get out of it alive. All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
My parents are a beacon of inspiration, and everything that I do is for them. And so they inspire me each and every day.
Oh, I love that. Thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, David.
Thank you so much, Jen. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks too to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR or you know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last, but certainly not least, make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it for me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.